Dr. Maya Turner adjusted her white coat and took a deep breath as she stepped through the towering glass doors of Crestview Hospital. The hum of bustling medical staff, the distant beep of monitors, and the scent of antiseptic filled her senses, marking the start of what she dreamed of for years, her first day as a surgical resident at one of the most prestigious hospitals in the region. Yet, her excitement was tinged with a nervous energy that coursed through her veins, making her palms slick. Maya had read everything she could about the senior surgeon overseeing her residency, Dr. Jacob Harland. He was known for his unparalleled skill, a brilliance that some called genius, but just as famous as his surgical precision was his reputation for being relentless, even ruthless, with his trainees. As Maya made her way to his office, she rehearsed what she would say, hoping her voice wouldn't betray the storm of emotions inside her. She reached his office door and knocked lightly. "Come in," a voice called. Steady and commanding, Maya entered, taking in the tall, gray-haired man standing behind his desk. He glanced up over his glasses, gave her a quick once-over, and returned his attention to a thick file in his hands. "Dr. Turner," he said, without looking up again, "welcome to Crestview." "Thank you, Dr. Harland," Maya replied, mustering a polite smile. "I'm looking forward to." "Residency is difficult here," he interrupted, his eyes finally meeting hers with a hard, assessing stare. "We have high standards. Not everyone meets them." He snapped the file shut and handed it to her. "Your schedule. Be on time. Always. I don't tolerate tardiness." Maya nodded, feeling the weight of his gaze as she took the file. "Understood." Without further words, he turned and strode out of the office, expecting her to follow. She straightened her shoulders, hiding her nervousness, and fell into step behind him as he led her through the hospital halls, pointing out various departments in clipped tones that gave her only seconds to absorb each detail. When they reached the main surgical ward, 2 other new residents were waiting, a young man with bright eyes and an easy smile, and a woman who radiated confidence. Dr. Harland greeted them with warmth Maya hadn't seen in his eyes before, and he introduced them to her with a barely disguised disinterest. She offered a brief smile, but Dr. Harland didn't give her time to get acquainted before he began the day's instructions. He focused on the 2 other residents, his back turned to her as if she wasn't there. Maya kept her expression neutral, even as frustration simmered beneath the surface. She wasn't here to make friends. She reminded herself. She was here to work. But when Dr. Harland handed her the day's first chart with a brusque, "Take the vitals," her fingers clenched around the file just slightly. The task was simple, barely scratching the surface of her abilities. But she knew Dr. Harland was watching her every move. She approached her first patient, her steps measured, her hands steady as she checked each vital sign with careful precision. Maya handed the chart back to Dr. Harland, who glanced at it for only a moment before nodding. "Fine," he muttered. No acknowledgement of her care. No welcome encouragement. Just a cold, impersonal "fine." The morning passed in this same rhythm. Brief instructions, evaluations, and Dr. Harland's impassive responses. He'd laugh with the other residents, ask them about their interests and ambitions, and offer words of encouragement. But with Maya, he kept things strictly clinical. The contrast was clear, and Maya forced herself to swallow her disappointment. By lunchtime, her stomach grumbled, but she decided to skip the cafeteria and take a quiet walk down one of the hospital corridors instead. As she passed by a group of nurses, she caught a snippet of conversation. "Did you see the new resident in surgery?" one nurse whispered, her voice carrying just enough for Maya to catch it. "Oh, the diversity hire?" another replied, smirking. "Yeah, I saw her. Wonder how long she'll last." The words froze Maya in her tracks for a moment. She felt a flash of heat rise to her cheeks but forced herself to keep walking, not letting them see her react. She clenched her jaw, the words echoing in her mind. Diversity hire. As if she hadn't graduated near the top of her class. As if she hadn't worked twice as hard to earn her place here. She took a deep breath. repeating the words her mother had always said to her. "You earned this, Maya. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." After a few moments, she returned to the cafeteria, picked up a sandwich, and found a corner table where she could sit alone. As she nibbled on her lunch, her eyes followed Dr. Harland as he entered with two senior doctors, laughing as they discussed a recent surgery. He didn't glance her way, but she could feel the invisible wall around her, marking her as an outsider in this place she had long dreamed of being. When she returned to the surgical floor that afternoon, Dr. Harland handed her another file, assigning her a simple post-operative checkup. His words were quick, his instructions devoid of detail, yet she focused on each step, determined to be thorough. When she returned the chart, he barely skimmed her notes, handing her a different task without a word. The day ended in much the same way. Dr. Harland offered praise and feedback to the other residents, while her work was met with silence. As Maya gathered her things to leave, she watched as the other residents laughed and chatted with each other, their ease with one another making her feel the weight of her isolation. She caught a murmur from two nurses nearby, one whispering, "I bet she'll be gone in 3 months." Maya took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and headed out into the cool evening air. She'd survived the day, even if she felt as if she were fighting alone. Tomorrow, she told herself, would be different. It had to be. Dr. Maya Turner arrived at Crestview Hospital the next morning with renewed determination. She tossed and turned all night, replaying her first day in her mind, hearing Dr. Harland's cold instructions and the murmured taunts of the nurses. Today, she'd push harder, work smarter, and prove that she belonged here as much as anyone else. As she entered the surgical floor, the air felt heavy with the usual hum of activity, scrubbed-in surgeons, bustling residents, and the click of nurses' shoes across the polished floors. She approached Dr. Harland, who was reviewing a patient file, his face stern and unreadable. Without looking up, he handed her a new chart. "Vitals and notes on this patient," he said, his tone brusque. "Routine. Follow the chart instructions exactly." Maya took the file, her lips pressed into a determined line. She nodded. "Yes, Dr. Harland." She quickly reviewed the chart, studying the details of the patient's history and following the checklist with precision. But while she was familiar with these tasks, each step felt like a reminder of her place here. She was given only the most basic responsibilities. Maya knew this was far from the learning she'd expected in her residency, where her peers were handling more complex cases and facing challenges that would advance their skills. As she moved through the hallway, she spotted Dr. Chun and Dr. Matthews, the two other new residents, discussing a patient's symptoms in depth with another surgeon. Given her family history, the risk factors might mean a non-standard procedure, Dr. Matthews said, sounding every bit the confident young doctor. Maya watched them for a moment, feeling a pang of frustration as she realized that Dr. Harland was willing to involve them in complex cases but wouldn't allow her the same chance. For now, she reminded herself, it would be about proving she could handle everything thrown her way, even if it meant these routine assignments. Returning to her station, Maya completed the task, carefully noting the patient's vitals. She was thorough, taking each detail as an opportunity to prove her capability, and handed the completed chart to Dr. Harland. He glanced at it briefly. "Fine," he muttered, and, before she could say a word, he moved on to speak with Dr. Matthews about a challenging surgical case. Maya felt the familiar tension settle into her shoulders as she watched him walk away. Fine. She'd given her best effort, but for Dr. Harland, fine was all she was getting. As she made her way to the break room, the murmurs started up again. Just outside the door, two nurses were talking in low voices, but Maya caught every word. "Have you seen Dr. Turner?" one nurse said, raising an eyebrow. "The diversity hire. I'm betting she's gone by Christmas." The other nurse chuckled, shaking her head. "She doesn't stand a chance if Dr. Harland's already dismissing her. He's impossible." Maya clenched her jaw and kept walking. She knew her worth, knew how hard she'd worked, and she wasn't about to let these whispers define her. She reached the cafeteria, grabbed a small sandwich, and sat at a corner table, too disheartened to join her fellow residents. She opened her journal, hoping to write her way out of her frustration. But the words wouldn't come. Her mind drifted, replaying her mother's steady voice in her head, reminding her, "You're here because you earned it. Maya, don't let anyone take that away." With a final, deep breath, she folded up her journal, squared her shoulders, and headed back to the surgical floor. The afternoon passed in a blur of more routine tasks, each one completed to the best of her ability. She tried to ignore the way Dr. Harland overlooked her, choosing instead to focus on doing every assignment with precision. Her frustration grew as she watched the other residents gain more complex assignments, while she was tasked with the basics. Each small victory felt hollow, a quiet reminder of her invisible place in the hospital hierarchy. As the day wound down, Maya spotted Dr. Chun and Dr. Matthews sitting together in the cafeteria. She decided to take a chance, gathering her courage and walking over to them. "Mind if I sit here?" she asked, keeping her tone light. Dr. Matthews looked up with a polite smile. "Oh, sure, of course." But before Maya could even sit, Dr. Chun glanced at her watch and stood. "Actually, I should get back early to prep for the afternoon." Dr. Matthews followed her lead. "Yeah, same here. Catch you later, Dr. Turner." Maya watched them leave, the ache of isolation settling in her chest. She'd hoped, just for a moment, to find a sense of camaraderie with her peers. But once again, she was left on her own. After lunch, Maya gathered her courage and returned to the floor. She carried out her next assignment with a quiet determination, her mind repeating her mother's words, grounding her through the mounting sense of rejection. She didn't need to be liked or accepted. She reminded herself she only needed to prove herself, one task at a time. Later in the day, while charting patient notes, she noticed two nurses watching her from across the hall. One was a black woman with her hair neatly tied back into a bun, who gave her a small nod. Maya took a deep breath and walked over. "Hi, I'm Dr. Turner," she introduced herself, extending her hand. The nurse shook her hand, her grip warm and firm. "Evelyn," she replied, offering a kind smile. "And this is Lila." Maya relaxed a little, her own smile surfacing. "Nice to meet you both." Evelyn and Lila exchanged a knowing glance before Evelyn leaned closer. "Things around here, they're not exactly what you'd call easy. Dr. Harland has a way of testing people, especially if they don't quite fit his mold." Maya felt her stomach drop. "So, it's not just me." Lila crossed her arms, sighing. "No, it's not. You're not the first resident he's singled out." Evelyn nodded, her voice lowering. "We've seen it before. Just be careful. And remember, if you need support, we're here." For the first time since she'd started, Maya felt a glimmer of solidarity. She wasn't alone in this. And while it was a small comfort, it gave her strength. She thanked them both, their quiet encouragement settling into her like a steady beat of resilience. The rest of her shift was as demanding as the morning had been. Dr. Harland handed her another basic file, a standard post-operative check-in, and moved on without a word. Maya tackled it with precision, determined to let her work speak for itself. Each time she turned in her notes, she held her head high, silently reminding herself that she belonged here. By the end of the day, exhaustion seeped into her bones, not from the tasks themselves, but from the mental strain of navigating an environment that felt so unwelcoming. She packed up her things and made her way to the hospital entrance, the weight of her isolation pressing down as she stepped into the cool evening air. As she looked back at the towering building, her mind was already racing with plans for the next day. She would return with even more resolve, her steps guided by the voices of her past, her family, her mentors. She wouldn't let the whispers or Dr. Harland's dismissive attitude break her spirit. With a final glance at the hospital, Maya whispered to herself, I've earned this. And with that, she walked away, her head held high, ready to face whatever tomorrow would bring. The next morning, Maya walked through the halls of Crestview Hospital with her head held high. But the burden of her isolation weighed heavily on her shoulders. Every hallway, every patient room, and every face around her reminded her that, despite her best efforts, she was still an outsider in a place she'd worked so hard to enter. Her routine was beginning to feel like a series of tests, all designed to see if she would crack under pressure. As she stepped into the surgical ward, Maya spotted Dr. Harland and the other residents gathered for the morning briefing. She took her place on the edge of the group, standing quietly as Dr. Harland flipped through his charts. Without so much as a glance in her direction, he began briefing the team, launching into a detailed case summary. "Dr. Matthews," he said, turning to the young man with a nod, "you'll be shadowing me in the OR today. We have a difficult vascular case that requires precision. Pay attention to every step." Dr. Matthews grinned, a spark of excitement lighting up his face. "Yes, Dr. Harland." Maya felt a pang of envy, quickly stifled, as Dr. Harland turned to the other resident, Dr. Chun, and assigned her to assist with an unusual postoperative case. When he finally looked her way, he handed Maya a chart with a barely concealed sigh. "Dr. Turner, vitals and routine checks. Stick to the basics." It stung, a reminder that he didn't trust her with anything beyond the simplest tasks. Swallowing her frustration, Maya accepted the assignment, nodding with as much composure as she could muster. "Fine," she thought. "If he wants basics, I'll make sure my basics are flawless." As the morning wore on, she moved between patients, taking each blood pressure reading and chart note with meticulous care. Her focus was interrupted when she overheard a familiar voice behind her, followed by a soft chuckle. "Let's just say Dr. Harland isn't easy on his residents, especially ones who don't quite fit his expectations," said one of the nurses she recognized from the day before. "Lila." Her voice was quiet, but the truth in her words struck deep. Maya felt a surge of gratitude toward Lila. Though she kept her eyes down and focused on her work, there was something in Lila's tone, an unspoken solidarity that gave Maya a sense of support she hadn't expected. When lunchtime arrived, Maya hesitated near the cafeteria, scanning the room for a place to sit. She noticed Dr. Chun and Dr. Matthews chatting animatedly at a table, but she quickly dismissed the idea of joining them. The two of them had hardly spoken to her since she arrived, and she was done trying to force connections that clearly weren't there. Instead, her eyes landed on a small table by the window where Lila and Evelyn, the other nurse from the day before, were sitting together. Taking a deep breath, Maya walked over, tray in hand. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, keeping her tone polite but hopeful. Evelyn looked up and smiled warmly. "Of course, Dr. Turner. Please, have a seat." Maya settled into the chair, grateful for the genuine welcome. She wasn't sure what to say, but Evelyn's kind eyes and Lila's supportive smile helped ease the tension that had knotted inside her since she'd started her residency. "How's the day going so far?" Lila asked, a hint of empathy in her voice. Maya took a deep breath, finally letting herself open up a bit. "To be honest, it's been rough," she admitted. "I feel like I'm constantly being sidelined. Dr. Harland barely looks at me, and when he does, it's like he's waiting for me to mess up." Lila and Evelyn exchanged a look that seemed to speak volumes, and Maya sensed that they understood far more than she'd realized. Evelyn leaned in slightly, her voice gentle but firm. "You're not imagining things, Maya. Dr. Harland has a reputation for being difficult, especially with people who don't fit his idea of a perfect resident. You're not the first one he's treated this way." Maya blinked, both relieved and saddened by the confirmation. She'd wondered if it was just her, if perhaps she'd misread the subtle, dismissive gestures. But hearing it from Evelyn felt like a validation of all the uneasy feelings she'd buried. "Is he like this with everyone?" Maya asked, a tinge of hope creeping into her voice. Lila shook her head. No, not everyone. Mostly with those who challenge his view of who should be here. You're smart. You're capable. And you're not what he expected. That makes you a target. Evelyn nodded, her expression filled with quiet sympathy. It's not fair, but it's how he operates. I've seen talented residents come through here, and some have left because of him. But I've also seen others stand their ground and find allies who help them through it. Maya felt a weight lift off her shoulders. For the first time, someone acknowledged what she was facing. Evelyn's words gave her a renewed sense of determination. Stand your ground. Find allies. She held on to those words, feeling their strength seep into her. Thank you, she said, her voice filled with sincerity. It helps to know I'm not alone in this. You're not, Evelyn replied, her tone reassuring. Lila and I were here. You need anything, or just someone to talk to, you come find us. As they finished their lunch, a warmth blossomed in Maya's chest. She'd come to Crestview expecting to prove herself, expecting to work hard and rise through the ranks. She hadn't expected, however, to encounter such overt barriers, and she hadn't expected to find allies willing to stand by her. After lunch, Maya returned to her work with a renewed sense of purpose. She moved through each patient assessment with precision, focusing on her technique and blocking out the dismissive glances from Dr. Harland. When he handed her a chart without so much as a word, she accepted it calmly, her resolve solid. The day continued, each passing moment a test of her patience and resilience. But now, with Evelyn and Lila's support, Maya felt a renewed confidence that pushed her forward. She wouldn't let the whispers or Dr. Harland's attitude cloud her vision. Later, as she was filing her final notes for the day, she noticed a familiar face in the hallway, Dr. Chen. Catching her eye, Maya gave her a polite nod. To her surprise, Dr. Chen hesitated for a moment before walking over. Long day? Dr. Chen asked, her voice casual but kind. Maya managed a small smile. Feels like that's the new normal. Dr. Chen gave a soft chuckle. It can be. With Dr. Harland, he's, well, let's just say he doesn't make things easy on anyone. Maya nodded, grateful for the momentary connection. Thank you. I wasn't sure if it was just me. Dr. Chen shrugged, a hint of sympathy in her eyes. You're not alone, Dr. Turner. He pushes everyone, but I've noticed he can be especially particular. Their brief exchange gave Maya a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, she could find more connections at Crestview. It wasn't friendship exactly, but it was acknowledgement, more than she'd received before. As she left the hospital that evening, Maya felt a strange blend of exhaustion and hope. The day had tested her patience, her endurance, and her confidence, but she'd survived. She'd made allies in Evelyn and Lila, and perhaps she'd even begun to find a tentative ally in Dr. Chen. For the first time since starting at Crestview, Maya felt a small glimmer of belonging. She still had miles to go, but she was no longer entirely alone. She'd found allies. And in this place, that was a powerful start. Maya's fourth day at Crestview began like any other, with a tight knot of anticipation in her stomach and a determination to prove herself. No matter the challenges, she'd learned to expect little acknowledgement, let alone praise, from Dr. Harland, who so far had treated her with the same cold detachment each day. But when she arrived that morning, she felt an unusual intensity in the air. Dr. Harland was standing at the nurse's station, his gaze hard and calculating as he scanned the room. He didn't look at her when he called her name. Dr. Turner, he said in a clipped tone, handing her a chart with several pages of detailed notes. You'll be handling preoperative care for Mr. Thomas Grant today. He's scheduled for a hernia repair, but he's one of our VIP patients, and that means no mistakes. Maya glanced down at the chart. The name seemed familiar, but she couldn't place it. Understood. Dr. Harland. His eyes narrowed as he looked at her, as though assessing her for any sign of doubt. Mr. Grant is on the hospital board. He expects the highest standards in care. and I won't tolerate anything less. Do you understand?
Yes.
Sir. Maya replied, steadying her tone. The gravity of his words settled over her. But her nerves only sharpened her focus. This was her chance to prove her skill, her dedication, and her professionalism. Dr. Harland turned abruptly and left, leaving her alone with Mr. Grant's chart. She reviewed it carefully, noting his medical history and the details of his scheduled procedure. As a board member, he was a powerful figure, someone whose opinion could carry significant weight. Maya felt a thrill of excitement mixed with apprehension. This was an opportunity she couldn't afford to squander. She took a steadying breath and headed toward Mr. Grant's room. As she entered, she found him seated in bed, casually scrolling through his phone. His silver hair, bright eyes, and relaxed expression conveyed an air of confidence. He looked up and smiled as she approached, his eyes crinkling warmly. "Good morning, Mr. Grant." Maya greeted him, keeping her tone professional but friendly. "I'm Dr. Maya Turner, one of the residents assisting with your care." "Dr. Turner," he replied, setting his phone aside. "It's nice to meet you." She smiled, appreciating his warmth. "Likewise."
Sir.
"I understand you're scheduled for a hernia repair this afternoon. I'll be conducting your preoperative assessment. Do you have any questions about the procedure?" Mr. Grant tilted his head, studying her for a moment. "I do have a few, actually. But first, tell me, how long have you been at Crestview?" His question caught her off guard. Maya hesitated, then replied, "Just a few days, actually. I started my residency here this week." He nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "Impressive. Crestview doesn't take on just anyone. Congratulations." "Thank you, sir," Maya said, her smile warming as she regained her focus. She steered the conversation back to his procedure. "The hernia repair is a straightforward operation. We'll make a small incision, repair the hernia, and you should be back on your feet in no time. With rest and proper pain management, your recovery should go smoothly." Mr. Grant leaned back, his expression one of approval. "I appreciate your thoroughness, Dr. Turner. It's always nice to know I'm in capable hands." Maya felt her cheeks warm slightly. "I try to be thorough. My goal is to ensure that everything goes as smoothly as possible." He chuckled, his laugh a deep, pleasant sound. "That's exactly what I like to hear. And how are you finding Crestview so far? It must be challenging." Maya paused, choosing her words carefully. "It's a rigorous environment, but I came here to learn, and I'm grateful for the opportunity." Mr. Grant nodded, as though reading between the lines. "I imagine it must be. Not everyone can handle the pressure here, but I can tell you've got what it takes." His words were simple, but there was a sincerity in his tone that left Maya feeling encouraged. As if, in this one brief exchange, he had seen her for who she truly was. "Thank you, sir," she replied quietly, her voice soft with appreciation.
"Well,
"Let's get this over with," Mr. Grant said with a reassuring smile. "I trust you'll keep things under control." Maya gave a slight nod and continued her assessment, feeling a renewed sense of purpose as she completed the preoperative checklist. It was rare for anyone at Crestview to acknowledge her dedication, and to have a patient like Mr. Grant notice her commitment was more validating than she'd expected. After finishing her rounds, she returned to Mr. Grant's room to finalize the preoperative paperwork. He seemed remarkably calm for someone about to undergo surgery, flipping through a magazine with an air of ease. As she checked his vitals one last time, he looked up, his expression curious. "Dr. Turner," he said, his tone casual yet probing. "Why did you choose Crestview?" Maya hesitated. It was the kind of question that felt both personal and professional, but she sensed he was genuinely interested. "I wanted a place that would push me to grow," she replied honestly. "Somewhere I could be challenged, where I could learn from the best." Mr. Grant nodded approvingly. "Good answer. I can see you have ambition." He paused, studying her. "I've spent a lot of time in places like this, Dr. Turner. Crestview has its challenges, but I can tell you the kind of person who can handle them. Maya felt a swell of gratitude. In a place where she'd struggled to find acceptance, here was someone who saw her dedication, her resilience, and her potential. "Thank you, Mr. Grant. I appreciate that," she said, her voice quiet but full of meaning. Mr. Grant's smile held a hint of encouragement.
Keep at it.
Dr. Turner. Sometimes all it takes is one person to shake things up. His words lingered with her as she left his room, giving her a renewed sense of confidence. She wasn't just here to complete a checklist or impress her superiors. She was here to make a difference, however small, and with Mr. Grant's quiet support, she felt as if she finally had someone who believed in her. The afternoon moved quickly as Maya readied herself for Mr. Grant's surgery. She reviewed his chart one last time, going over each detail in her mind, knowing how important it was to be vigilant. When she entered the scrub room to prepare, she felt her heart pounding with a mix of nerves and anticipation. She would be assisting Dr. Harland during the surgery, and she knew this procedure was not only crucial for Mr. Grant, but also an opportunity to demonstrate her skills. The operating room was a blur of sterile blue and silver, bright lights, and focused faces. Maya took her place beside Dr. Harland, who was already positioning himself, his attention fixed solely on the task at hand. "Let's get this done efficiently," he said sharply, glancing briefly at Maya. "No mistakes." The initial stages of the surgery went smoothly. Maya watched Dr. Harland's every move, ready to anticipate his needs, handing him instruments with practiced precision. The surgical team worked seamlessly, their motions synchronized, and Maya felt her confidence grow with each successful step.
But then,
as Dr. Harland prepared to make a deeper incision, Maya noticed something, a subtle yet critical detail in the anatomy he was about to navigate. She visualized the patient's scans in her mind, remembering an artery that ran closer to the hernia than usual. Dr. Harland's angle was off, and if he continued, there was a risk of hitting the artery and causing excessive bleeding. Her pulse quickened, knowing the consequences of speaking up in the middle of surgery, especially with a surgeon like Dr. Harland. But Mr. Grant's words echoed in her mind. Sometimes all it takes is one person to shake things up. Taking a breath, Maya spoke in a low, steady voice. "Dr. Harland, I'd suggest adjusting the angle slightly. The artery runs closer than expected here." The room fell silent, and Dr. Harland froze mid-motion. His head snapped toward her, his eyes narrowing with a look that could cut through steel. "Excuse me, Dr. Turner?" he asked, his tone icy. Maya kept her voice calm. The imaging showed a slight deviation in the artery's position. A minor adjustment could reduce the risk of hitting it. For a moment, she thought he might dismiss her outright, or worse, reprimand her in front of the entire team. But after a tense silence, he turned back to the incision, his movements rigid, almost resentful. As he shifted his angle slightly, the cut went through without incident. Blood flow remained steady, and the surgery continued smoothly. Dr. Harland didn't acknowledge her input, didn't even look her way. But Maya knew that her suggestion had been the right call. When the surgery concluded, Mr. Grant was stabilized and moved to recovery. As Maya helped clean up, Dr. Harland left the operating room without a word, his silence more cutting than any reprimand. She tried to convince herself that she'd done the right thing, that she'd prioritized the patient's safety. But a knot of tension remained in her chest. As she stepped out into the hallway to catch her breath, she found Dr. Harland waiting for her, his face set in a rigid mask of barely contained anger. "Dr. Turner," he said, his voice low and seething. "A word." Maya followed him to a quiet corner, bracing herself for what was to come. Dr. Harland's face was a mask of cold fury as he led Maya down the hall and away from the bustling surgical floor. She felt her pulse quicken, but she kept her head high, her thoughts steady. She knew she'd done the right thing in the operating room. She'd protected Mr. Grant, and that was all that mattered. Finally, he stopped in a secluded corner near the stairwell, his eyes piercing into hers with barely suppressed rage. "Who do you think you are?" he demanded. His voice a sharp, low hiss. "You're a first-year resident, Dr. Turner. You don't interrupt my procedures to advise me on surgical technique." Maya held his gaze, her face impassive, though her heart hammered in her chest. "I wasn't trying to question your judgment, Dr. Harland. I simply saw a potential risk to the patient and spoke up." "Spoke up?" His voice rose, his tone dripping with disdain. "Do you realize what you risked by speaking up? Do you think I don't know my own anatomy? That I can't handle a routine procedure without your amateur input?" The sting of his words pressed against her, but Maya took a steadying breath and kept her voice firm. "I believe that prioritizing the patient's safety is our first responsibility. And based on the imaging, I saw something worth adjusting." He clenched his jaw, his lips tightening. "You don't get to decide what's worth adjusting, Dr. Turner. You are here to observe, to assist, and to learn not to undermine me in my own operating room." She could feel the weight of his authority pressing down on her, but she refused to back down. With respect,
"Sir."
"I would have spoken up for any patient. I didn't intend to undermine you, but I did intend to prevent a potential issue." He stared at her, his eyes blazing with a fury she had only seen hinted at until now. For a moment, it felt like he was on the edge of yelling, and she braced herself for whatever might come.
But then,
A new voice interrupted them. "Is there a problem here?" The voice was quiet but firm, cutting through the tension with a calm authority that surprised them both. Maya turned to see Mr. Thomas Grant, seated in a wheelchair and flanked by a nurse. His gaze was steady, assessing, and Maya could see the sharp intelligence in his eyes. Though his voice was calm, there was no mistaking the authority in his presence. Dr. Harland stiffened immediately, his face twisting into a forced smile. "Mr. Grant, you should be resting. We were merely discussing Dr. Turner's approach to patient care." Mr. Grant's eyes narrowed slightly as he looked between them. "Approach to patient care?" he echoed, his gaze settling on Maya. "Dr. Turner, was everything handled properly during the surgery?" Maya hesitated, sensing the unspoken warning in Dr. Harland's stare. She knew that any response she gave would be weighed heavily, that her next words could carry real consequences. She chose them carefully.
"Yes."
"Mr. Grant," she said finally,
Her voice calm.
"the surgery went smoothly. You're on track for full recovery." Mr. Grant nodded, though his expression remained thoughtful, as if he could sense there was more to the story. "Glad to hear it."
He paused.
Then looked directly at Dr. Harland.
"Still."
"I'd like to speak with both of you privately once I'm feeling up to it. I have a few questions." The smile on Dr. Harland's face tightened, but he nodded. "Of course. Rest assured, Mr. Grant. Everything was handled with the utmost care." The nurse wheeled Mr. Grant back toward his room, and Maya watched as he disappeared down the hall, her heart still racing from the confrontation. She turned back to Dr. Harland, who was watching her with a look of barely concealed loathing. "This isn't over, Dr. Turner," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You may have made an impression on Mr. Grant, but don't think that will protect you. Remember your place." With that, he strode away, leaving Maya standing alone in the hall. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, refusing to let the weight of his threat crush her spirit. She had done her job, and that was all that mattered. Later that afternoon, as Maya finished her rounds, a nurse approached her with a note. "Mr. Grant has requested a private meeting," she said, a flicker of interest in her eyes. "He asked that you and Dr. Harland both be present." Maya's stomach tightened as she accepted the note. She wasn't sure what Mr. Grant had planned, but something told her this would be more than a routine check-in. When she arrived at Mr. Grant's room, Dr. Harland was already there, standing by the window, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He looked at her with a cold indifference, but Maya held her head high and took a seat by the bedside. Mr. Grant greeted her with a nod before addressing them both. "Thank you for coming. I wanted to clear the air about what happened during my surgery." Dr. Harland offered a tight, forced smile, Of course. Mr. Grant, as I mentioned before, there's nothing to be concerned about. Dr. Turner is a new resident, and I was simply offering her guidance. Mr. Grant raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. Guidance? Because what I overheard sounded a lot more like a reprimand. He looked at Maya, his gaze steady. Dr. Turner, I'd like to hear your side of the story. Maya glanced at Dr. Harland, who was watching her with a look of veiled menace. But she met Mr. Grant's gaze, her voice steady. During your surgery, I noticed that Dr. Harland's positioning was close to an artery, she explained, choosing her words carefully. Based on the imaging, I thought there was a risk of hitting it. So, I suggested a minor adjustment. Mr. Grant nodded thoughtfully. And did Dr. Harland follow your suggestion?
Yes.
Sir, she replied. He adjusted his angle, and the surgery continued without any issues. Dr. Harland's expression darkened, and he cut in sharply. With all due respect, Mr. Grant, Dr. Turner is a resident. She misinterpreted a situation during the procedure, and I had to correct her. This could have compromised your safety. Mr. Grant's gaze hardened. That's interesting, Dr. Harland, because I spoke to some of the nurses in the OR. They said Dr. Turner's observation actually prevented a potential complication. A flash of surprise crossed Dr. Harland's face before he quickly masked it, his expression turning defensive. Mr. Grant, with all due respect, sometimes junior staff don't see the full picture. I had everything under control. Mr. Grant's voice turned cold, his patience clearly wearing thin. Dr. Harland, I'm not just any patient. I'm a board member here at Crestview. I expect transparency, especially when it concerns my care. The color drained from Dr. Harland's face, his usual confident demeanor faltering. Mr. Grant, I assure you, I acted with the highest standards of care. Mr. Grant shook his head, his tone calm but unyielding. From what I've observed, it seems there's a troubling pattern in how you interact with certain staff members, especially Dr. Turner. Dr. Harland clenched his jaw, his voice dropping to a careful, restrained tone. If Dr. Turner feels I've been overly critical, it's because I hold high standards. It's my responsibility to prepare residents for the demands of this profession. Mr. Grant's gaze didn't waver. It looks more to me like you've been undermining her competence and setting her up to fail. That's not high standards, Dr. Harland. That's poor leadership. Maya felt a surge of gratitude mixed with disbelief as Mr. Grant spoke, his words cutting through Dr. Harland's facade. Dr. Harland seemed to struggle to maintain his composure, his hands tightening into fists at his sides. Mr. Grant, I assure you, my only goal is to ensure the best care for our patients. Then perhaps it's time you reevaluate how you achieve that goal. Mr. Grant replied coldly. I will be reporting this incident to the board, and I'll be requesting a full account from the surgical team. Dr. Harland's face flushed with a mix of anger and humiliation, but he quickly forced a neutral expression. Understood, Mr. Grant. With a final nod to Maya, Mr. Grant dismissed them. Dr. Harland exited the room without a word, his posture rigid, and Maya watched him go, feeling a sense of both relief and disbelief. Mr. Grant turned to her, his expression softening. Dr. Turner, I apologize for what you've had to endure. It shouldn't take a situation like this for someone to recognize your dedication. Maya felt a wave of emotion rise in her throat, but she held it back, managing a grateful smile. Thank you, Mr. Grant. Your support means a lot. He nodded, his eyes kind. You showed integrity. Not everyone would have had the courage to do what you did in that operating room. People like you make places like this better. As Maya left his room, she felt a powerful sense of validation. She had stood her ground, protected her patient,
And,
for the first time, someone in a position of power had noticed. Her struggle wasn't over. But for the first time since she'd set foot in Crestview, Maya felt the promise of real change. News of Mr. Grant's confrontation with Dr. Harland spread through Crestview Hospital like wildfire. Maya noticed the shift almost immediately. Curious glances from her peers. whispers in the hallways, and even a few sympathetic nods from nurses who had once only offered her silence. The tension between her and Dr. Harland had gone from a quiet struggle to a public ordeal, and the hospital's administration took notice. 2 days after the meeting, Maya received a formal notice requesting her presence in a conference room for a board-led investigation into Dr. Harland's conduct. She felt a mixture of dread and relief. She hadn't asked for this attention, hadn't expected her decision in the OR to snowball into a full-blown investigation, but she knew it was necessary. Dr. Harland's behavior was finally being questioned, and she might finally have the chance to speak her truth. The morning of the meeting, Maya straightened her white coat, took a deep breath, and entered the conference room. Inside, 3 members of the hospital board sat at a long table, including Mr. Grant. His presence was a quiet reassurance, a reminder that someone in power believed her. Mr. Grant gave her a slight nod as she took her seat. "Thank you for coming, Dr. Turner," began Ms. Lawton, a sharp-eyed board member with silver hair and a serious expression. "We've been made aware of some concerning allegations regarding Dr. Harland's treatment of residents. We'd like you to recount your experiences with him in detail." Maya took a steadying breath, choosing her words carefully. "Dr. Harland has a reputation for holding high standards, and I knew this coming in. But what I didn't expect was to be repeatedly sidelined from meaningful assignments. From day one, he assigned me only the most basic tasks, regardless of my skill or initiative." She paused, glancing briefly at Mr. Grant before continuing. "Every time I tried to participate more fully or make a suggestion, he would dismiss me, often publicly. He created an environment where it felt like I had to prove myself twice as hard just to be seen." Ms. Lawton nodded, jotting down notes. "Were there other incidents similar to what happened during Mr. Grant's surgery?" "Yes," Maya replied, her voice steady. "There was a clear pattern. Even when I followed every instruction exactly, he would often find fault or barely acknowledge my work. It felt like nothing I did would ever be enough." One of the other board members, a man with a quiet but intense demeanor, leaned forward. "Did you ever report these incidents before now?" Maya hesitated, considering how to frame her answer. "No," she admitted. "I'd heard from other residents and staff that Dr. Harland's reputation was well known, and I worried that speaking up would only make things harder for me. I thought it was just something I had to endure." Ms. Lawton's expression softened, and she exchanged a look with Mr. Grant, who gave her a reassuring nod. "Thank you, Dr. Turner. That's all for now. We appreciate your courage in coming forward." As Maya left the conference room, she felt a mix of relief and vulnerability. She'd finally spoken her truth, but a part of her wondered if it would be enough. Would the board take her words seriously, or would Dr. Harland's influence prevail? Over the next several days, word of the investigation circulated through the hospital. Maya was called back for follow-up questions, and she noticed that more and more staff members were being interviewed as well. She passed her colleagues in the hallways, exchanging wary glances with other residents,
Doctors.
and nurses, some of whom she barely knew but who nodded at her now with newfound respect. One afternoon, she ran into Evelyn in the break room. The nurse looked around to make sure they were alone before speaking. "They interviewed me yesterday," Evelyn said quietly. "I told them everything I've seen, how Dr. Harland singles out certain residents, especially those who don't fit his idea of who belongs here." Maya's heart swelled with gratitude. "Thank you, Evelyn. That means a lot." Evelyn gave her a firm nod. "You're not alone in this."
People are starting to speak up.
Lila was interviewed,
2.
and so were a few other nurses who've seen how he treats people. The revelation lifted Maya's spirits. She had started this journey feeling alone, as though she were the only one bearing the weight of Dr. Harland's scrutiny.
But now,
It was clear others had witnessed the same behavior, and they were willing to stand by her. A few days later, Maya was surprised to see Dr. Chen waiting for her near the surgical floor. The normally reserved resident shifted uncomfortably before speaking. I wanted to say something,"
Dr. Chen began.
avoiding Maya's eyes. I know I didn't exactly make things easier for you, but when they asked me about Dr. Harland, I told them the truth. I've seen how he treats you differently. I didn't think much of it at first.
But, well,
It's pretty obvious now. Maya felt a rush of surprise and gratitude. Thank you, Dr. Chun. It means a lot that you were honest about what you've seen. Dr. Chun managed a small, tentative smile. You're stronger than I gave you credit for. I just thought you should know. With that, she walked away, leaving Maya feeling a glimmer of hope. The more people who spoke up, the clearer the picture became. This wasn't just about her. It was about a culture that had gone unchecked for too long. The investigation continued, and each day brought new stories, new testimonies. It became clear that Dr. Harlan's behavior wasn't an isolated incident. Residents, nurses, and even junior doctors shared experiences that painted a damning picture of his selective treatment and subtle bias. Finally, the hospital board announced that Dr. Harland had been officially suspended pending the investigation's outcome. The news sent ripples through the entire hospital. Maya noticed the shocked, quiet looks on her colleagues' faces as they absorbed the news. Some were sympathetic, while others seemed more interested in the spectacle of it all. But to Maya, it was a turning point.
as she walked down the hall later that day,
She saw Dr. Harlan storming toward the exit, his face pale and tense with rage. His usually commanding presence had crumbled.
and he didn't look at her as he passed.
She felt a strange mix of relief and disbelief watching him go. She hadn't set out to bring him down, but she couldn't deny the justice in seeing him held accountable. In the days that followed, Maya felt the hospital's atmosphere begin to shift. Colleagues who had once ignored her now greeted her with respectful nods, and a few even stopped to express their support. Dr. Matthews, a fellow resident who had previously kept his distance, approached her in the break room one afternoon.
Hey,
Dr. Turner, he said awkwardly, shifting his weight. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I didn't realize what you were going through with Dr. Harland. It took courage to stand up like that. Maya offered a small, forgiving smile. Thank you, Dr. Matthews. I appreciate it. Throughout the investigation, she found herself in an unexpected spotlight. Board members commended her for her courage, and several staff members voiced their admiration for her willingness to speak up. She accepted their praise with humility, knowing how close she'd come to giving up. A month later, the board reached its final decision. Dr. Harlan's employment was officially terminated. The announcement was made in a hospital-wide email, and though it was brief, the impact was undeniable. For years, he had been seen as untouchable, a fixture at Crestview.
but now,
Because of the voices that had united to hold him accountable, the hospital was finally forced to acknowledge its flaws. Mr. Grant took it a step further, leveraging his influence to introduce new policies aimed at fostering a more inclusive and supportive environment. In a follow-up memo, the administration outlined plans for diversity and inclusion training, bringing in outside experts to guide staff at every level. Additionally, a new committee was established to ensure these values became embedded in the hospital's culture. Maya felt a deep sense of validation, but she knew this wasn't just her victory. It was a win for every resident,
nurse,
and staff member who had ever felt dismissed or sidelined. As she walked the hospital halls that afternoon, she noticed that her colleagues looked at her with a respect that hadn't been there before. She was no longer just a resident. She was someone who had challenged the system and, against all odds, had won. When Mr. Grant invited her to join the newly formed Diversity and Mentorship Committee, she accepted without hesitation. Her experience made her especially invested in shaping a safer, more welcoming environment. She wanted to help make Crestview a place where new residents, like her younger self, would be supported and valued for their skills and dedication. One afternoon, while mentoring a new resident named Jordan, Maya felt a quiet sense of purpose settle over her. Jordan reminded her of herself, determined, talented, and unsure of where they fit in. You're doing great, she told Jordan, offering a warm smile. This place can be tough, But remember, you belong here just as much as anyone else. Jordan's face lit up with relief. Thank you, Dr. Turner. It helps knowing someone else has been through this and come out stronger. Months later, the hospital held a ceremony to celebrate its renewed commitment to diversity and inclusion. Mr. Grant gave a speech highlighting the progress made. And when he called Maya's name, she felt a wave of warmth as she walked to the front. Mr. Grant shook her hand, addressing the crowd. Dr. Maya Turner exemplifies the values we're striving for at Crestview: dedication, resilience, and a commitment to excellence and fairness. Her courage has set a new standard for us all. As she looked out at the audience, Maya spotted her mother near the front, pride shining in her eyes. They shared a quiet, understanding nod, and Maya felt the weight of everything she'd been through transform into a sense of fulfillment. She had come to Crestview to learn and grow as a doctor, but she had found something deeper, a purpose beyond medicine. She wasn't just a part of the hospital now, she was part of its transformation, paving the way for a better future. And as she looked out at her colleagues, she felt, for the first time, that she truly belonged. With Dr. Harlan's departure and the hospital's transformation underway, Crestview was nearly unrecognizable from the tense, unwelcoming place Maya had entered just months before. Staff seemed to walk with lighter steps. The silence that had once weighed heavily over the hallways now filled with a sense of renewed energy. And Maya,
For the first time,
felt not only that she belonged, but that she had helped make Crestview a place worth belonging to. The new Diversity and Mentorship Committee, which Maya had eagerly joined, was just getting off the ground. But its impact was already palpable. A monthly series of workshops was introduced, focusing on cultural sensitivity, leadership, and inclusive practices. Staff members from all departments attended, and Maya felt a surge of pride each time she saw colleagues fully engaged in conversations that, before, might have gone unspoken. One afternoon, as she prepared for rounds, she noticed a familiar figure in the hallway: Jordan, the new resident she'd taken under her wing. Jordan looked nervous, their eyes darting to a group of doctors talking nearby. Maya remembered those early days, the isolation, the uncertainty, the feeling of being unseen, and felt a renewed commitment to her role as a mentor. Jordan, she called softly, and they looked over, relief flooding their face. Dr. Turner. Jordan greeted her, managing a small smile. I was just trying to get a read on everything. There's a lot to keep up with. Maya smiled, remembering how daunting the early days had felt. I know exactly what you mean. Crestview's pace can feel overwhelming. But remember, this place is here to teach you, not test you. Lean on people, ask questions, and give yourself time to grow. Jordan nodded, the tension in their shoulders visibly easing. It helps knowing someone like you is here.
To be honest,
I thought I might have to handle all of this alone. You don't, Maya assured them, her voice firm with conviction. There's a community here for you. And if you ever feel like you're being sidelined or dismissed,
come to me.
We're in this together. A look of gratitude softened Jordan's expression, and Maya felt her own sense of purpose deepen. She had longed for support when she first arrived.
And now,
she was determined to be that pillar for others. In the days that followed, Maya began to notice more changes around the hospital. Nurses who had once kept their heads down now chatted openly with doctors. Residents began to interact more closely with the senior staff, encouraged to ask questions and share observations without fear of reprisal. Even the leadership team took part in monthly discussions led by outside experts, exploring ways to dismantle the rigid hierarchy that had, for so long, silenced fresh perspectives. Mr. Grant, now a regular figure at these meetings, showed a clear commitment to fostering an inclusive environment, and he sought Maya's feedback often. One afternoon, as they met to review the committee's progress, he gave her a thoughtful look. Maya, he began, it's clear you're making a difference here. You're doing more than just fulfilling your role. You're changing the culture. How does it feel?
She paused,
considering his words. It feels rewarding. When I came here, I thought my purpose was to become the best doctor I could be.
But now,
I see that my purpose is also to make this place better for others. To make sure no one feels alone here again. Mr. Grant nodded, a proud smile on his face. Exactly what I hoped to hear. Crestview is lucky to have you, Dr. Turner. You've shown all of us what it means to lead with integrity. The words sank into her, their weight both humbling and empowering. She had once seen Mr. Grant as simply a patient.
but now,
He was a partner in this journey toward lasting change. Later that evening, Maya received a call from Dr. Harlan's replacement, Dr. Eva Carlisle, a brilliant surgeon known for her mentorship and focus on fostering young talent. Maya had heard only good things about Dr. Carlisle, and after her experiences with Dr. Harlan, she was eager for the fresh start. Dr. Turner, I'm looking forward to working with you, Dr. Carlisle said, her tone warm and encouraging. I've reviewed your progress, and I must say, I'm impressed. I'd like to involve you in some more complex cases moving forward. Maya's heart lifted, excitement and relief mixing within her. Thank you, Dr. Carlisle. I'm ready for the challenge. Dr. Carlisle chuckled softly. From what I hear, you're more than ready. Crestview needs more doctors like you, and I'm looking forward to seeing you reach your full potential. When Maya ended the call, she felt a rush of gratitude for the new opportunities and the chance to work with someone who saw her potential rather than her limitations. The next morning, Maya joined Dr. Carlisle in the OR for the first time. The surgical team was efficient, the atmosphere focused yet welcoming. As Dr. Carlisle guided her through the procedure, she offered gentle feedback, encouragement,
and, for the first time,
Maya felt she was being trained as an equal, a colleague who had a future. Maya, Dr. Carlisle said, at one point, I want you to take the lead on this next step. The weight of responsibility settled over her. But instead of fear, Maya felt a quiet confidence rise within. She moved forward, steadying herself, and as she completed the task with precision, Dr. Carlisle nodded approvingly. Well done, she said, giving Maya a smile. You're a natural. It was a simple affirmation, but it felt monumental. Maya's journey had been marked by struggle and resistance.
but now,
Under Dr. Carlisle's guidance, she felt her skill and confidence growing in tandem. When the procedure was complete, Maya stepped out of the OR with a renewed sense of purpose. She was no longer just proving herself. She was becoming the doctor she'd always hoped to be. In the weeks that followed, Maya's reputation as a skilled and compassionate doctor grew, and she noticed the way her colleagues began to look at her with respect. Dr. Carlisle continued to mentor her, involving her in complex cases and encouraging her to push her boundaries. Maya felt herself thriving in ways she hadn't anticipated, her confidence blooming as she tackled each new challenge. One afternoon, while reviewing patient files, Dr. Carlisle turned to her with a smile. Maya, she said, I've been looking for someone to help lead a new initiative we're starting, a resident mentorship program. I think you'd be perfect for it. Maya blinked, surprised and honored. I'd love to, Dr. Carlisle. Thank you for considering me. Dr. Carlisle's eyes softened with approval. You're not just an excellent doctor, Maya, you're a leader. I've seen how you work with the other residents, how you help them find their confidence. That's exactly what this program needs. As Maya left Dr. Carlisle's office, she felt a quiet pride settle in her chest. She had come to Crestview expecting only to grow as a doctor, but she had found something deeper, a calling to lead, to help others find their own strength in the same halls where she had once felt so alone. The mentorship program launched soon after, and Maya dove into it with her whole heart, working closely with new residents, guiding them through the challenges and triumphs of hospital life. Her experiences with Dr. Harlan had shaped her,
but now,
she was using those experiences to empower others. The cycle of isolation and fear had been broken, replaced with support, solidarity,
and growth.
At the end of her shift one evening, Maya paused by the hospital entrance, looking out over the city skyline. The struggles she had endured, the small victories and deep challenges, had all brought her here, to a place where she could finally stand tall. She pulled out her phone and dialed her mother, eager to share the latest news. The phone barely rang once before her mother picked up, her voice warm and familiar. "Maya, how's my favorite doctor doing?" Maya smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Better than ever.
Mom.
I've started mentoring new residents.
And today,
Dr. Carlisle asked me to help lead the program." Her mother let out a proud laugh. "I knew you'd make it. Maya, you're exactly where you're meant to be." Maya looked back at Crestview, the building that had once felt so daunting now shining with possibility. "I think so too," she replied softly. "I really think I am." As she hung up, Maya felt the weight of her journey transform into something brighter, something filled with hope. Crestview was no longer just a hospital, it was a place she had helped to transform. A place where she could continue to grow and inspire others. Her path had only just begun. But she knew one thing for certain: she was ready for whatever came next. Months passed, and Crestview Hospital continued its transformation, guided by the changes Maya had helped set in motion. The mentorship program thrived, creating an environment where new residents felt supported and empowered. For Maya, the hospital had shifted from a proving ground to a place of community, purpose, and pride. One morning, as Maya reviewed her notes in the break room, she was interrupted by a knock on the door. She looked up to see Mr. Grant standing there with a warm smile, holding a small plaque in his hands. "Good morning, Dr. Turner. I hope I'm not interrupting," he said. Stepping into the room, Maya stood, surprised but pleased to see him. "Mr. Grant, it's always a pleasure." He handed her the plaque, his expression one of genuine gratitude. "This is for you. The board wanted to thank you for your contributions to Crestview. You've done more for this hospital than you realize." Maya took the plaque, reading the inscription, "In recognition of Dr. Maya Turner, for dedication, resilience, and commitment to a better Crestview." Her heart swelled as she looked back at Mr. Grant, overwhelmed with gratitude. I don't know what to say," she managed, her voice thick with emotion. Mr. Grant smiled. "You don't need to say anything. Just know that we're grateful for everything you've done. You didn't just change Crestview, you gave it a future." The words resonated deeply, filling her with a sense of pride she hadn't allowed herself to feel before. "Thank you, Mr. Grant. I couldn't have done it alone. You believed in me when few others did." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes, all it takes is one person's courage to show the rest of us the way." As he left, Maya held the plaque close, reflecting on how far she'd come. She'd entered Crestview as an outsider, uncertain of her place. Yet she'd found a way to transform the hospital and herself through resilience, purpose, and the support of those who believed in her. Later that day, Maya joined Dr. Carlisle in the OR for a complex procedure. She felt the familiar rush of excitement and focus as she scrubbed in. But today held a new significance. Dr. Carlisle had told her the week before that she would be taking the lead on this procedure, a testament to the faith her mentor had in her skills and growth.
"Ready?"
"Dr. Turner?"
Dr. Carlisle asked,
smiling beneath her surgical mask as they prepared to begin. Maya nodded, her nerves steeling into quiet determination. "Ready." As she made the first incision, guiding the team with calm precision, she felt an unshakable confidence. She moved with purpose, her hands steady and her focus unwavering. Each step brought her closer to the realization of her dreams, of the doctor she had fought so hard to become. The procedure went smoothly, and as they finished, Dr. Carlisle placed a hand on Maya's shoulder. "Exceptional work, Dr. Turner. You've truly come into your own." Maya thanked her, her heart soaring with pride. She had not only survived her journey at Crestview, she had thrived, growing beyond the expectations of others and into a leader she could be proud of.
As the weeks went by,
Maya continued her work in the mentorship program, meeting regularly with residents and guiding them through the highs and lows of their early careers. She saw herself in so many of them: the nervousness, the desire to prove oneself, and the occasional doubt. But she also saw something more: a collective sense of purpose, a belief that they could make a difference. One afternoon, Jordan, the resident she had mentored from the beginning, approached her with a small gift. Inside was a beautifully crafted notebook, with Dr. Turner, guide and mentor, embossed on the cover. "Thank you, Dr. Turner," Jordan said, their voice full of emotion. "You've made Crestview a place where we feel like we belong." Maya's eyes welled with tears as she took the notebook, flipping through its blank pages, each one representing the journeys of future residents she would help guide. "Thank you, Jordan. It's been an honor working with you." The gift served as a reminder of the legacy she was building, a legacy that would continue through the residents she mentored, the changes she championed, and the environment she had helped create. As Maya left the hospital that evening, she paused by the entrance, looking back at the building that had once intimidated her. It was no longer just a workplace, it was a symbol of transformation, a testament to her strength and the support she'd found along the way. Her phone buzzed, and she smiled as she saw her mother's name on the screen.
"Hi,
"Mom," she answered, her voice bright with joy. "Maya, I heard you're being recognized at Crestview," her mother exclaimed. "I'm so proud of you. Sweetheart, you've worked so hard, and now everyone else can see it too." Maya laughed, the pride in her mother's voice filling her heart. "Thank you,
Mom.
I couldn't have done it without your support. You always believed in me, even when things were hard." Her mother's voice softened. "And I always will.
Maya,
You're a force of change, and you're making a difference. That's all any mother could hope for." As Maya ended the call, she felt a sense of closure and excitement for the future. She had turned her struggles into strengths, her fears into purpose, and her dreams into reality. She walked to her car, her steps light with the knowledge that she had not only earned her place at Crestview but had made it a place worth belonging to for so many others. As she drove away, Maya couldn't help but think of all the challenges she'd overcome, the friendships she'd made, and the lives she'd touched. Crestview would continue to grow and change, just as she would, but her journey had left an indelible mark. And in that moment, she knew that her legacy was only just beginning.